Hi everybody and welcome to my first lesson on YouTube. So this is a brand new thing that we are starting out because of the COVID-19 outbreak. I'm hoping that it'll be really useful. So we're going to have a look at chapter 4 today. Chapter 4 in your work booklets, it should start on page 41. So if you grab your work booklets out now and get page 41 out, then we'll be able to go through this together. Okay, so when we look at chapter 4 or unit 4, it says Introduction to Communication in Health and Social Care, Adults, Children and Young People and Early Years and Childcare Settings. Okay, so we are going to be looking at it in terms of communication with older people, communication with younger people, communication with children, people with learning difficulties, children with learning difficulties as well. Because the idea of this unit is so that you can show the examiners that you understand how to communicate with individuals. So all of those people in that age, in the age ranges that we're looking at, so throughout life. So on your first question, we've actually displayed it as a poster. Now, in terms of your work here, what you can do is you can use the page that you've been provided with on page 43 to create a poster. And what it says is identify a range of communication methods. So when we think about a range of communication methods, we are thinking about verbal. So verbal being talking to others. Non-verbal communication. So non-verbal communication meaning everything that we do when we are communicating, but not the words that we're sort of speaking. So like me now, I'm smiling. I feel a little bit nervous doing this. So that's probably why. My body language is normally much more expressive, which again is a non-verbal form of communication. We also have different ones. So Makaton is another form. Makaton you may or may not have heard of. So Makaton is used by various different people actually, but mainly I've seen it used in childhood settings, so young children and adults with learning disabilities. So Makaton is like sign language, but it's not as complex. So the sign that you make is very simple in comparison to British Sign Language. You can have a look at some other videos on YouTube of Makaton as well. British Sign Language is another example of a communication method. So British Sign Language is a much more complex language than Makaton. Okay, so British Sign Language is a registered language in the UK. I taught a lady previously whose first language was British Sign Language because she was born hearing but to a deaf family. So her first language that she acquired from birth was British Sign Language. I found that quite fascinating myself. So British Sign Language is sort of much more complicated in the way that it is formed than Makaton. People that are teaching it need to be fully registered to teach it. It is, like I say, it's a language on its own, so it's a bit like me going out and learning French, you know, if you think of it that way. Again, you can have a look at some YouTube clips. You might wish to learn maybe your name as an alphabet in British Sign Language. Braille. So Braille is used by people that cannot see. So it's the thing that you feel. Can you see my hand? It's the thing that you feel, like the little bumps on the paper. And it's sort of raised so that people can feel the different words and letters. Again, I am not trained in Braille. If somebody came to me needing Braille for their lessons, I would have to seek expert help because that is not something that I could create myself. But you'll see it everywhere. If you've got some paracetamol or ibuprofen at home, you'll feel there's some raised bumps there. That is Braille. So like I say, that is used by people who are blind or severely visually impaired. Signs and symbols. So Signs and symbols can be used as a communication method. So it may be that you are trying to communicate with a small child and they are not able to say what they want. Perhaps they need the toilet. Maybe a symbol of the toilet is going to help them to say yes or no. Written communication, so that's about obviously writing things down, which is what you're about to do. So what I would like you to do for question 24 on page 43, like I say, you can use the paper that you are provided with, is to create a poster of 4 different communication methods. Okay. I have an example of one here. I'm not sure if this will come up, so I'll talk through it as well. So we've got verbal communication, words which are spoken, such as conversations, radio and phone calls. Non-verbal communication, communication through body language, facial expression, gestures and tone of voice. Written communication, words which are written, such as bus timetables, menus, newspapers. Obviously you can talk about things like magazines as well. A Makaton, a language system using speech, signs and symbols, which was developed to enable people with communication difficulties. So nice and simple there. It should only take you sort of maybe 15 minutes or so. What I would like you to do is to pause this video and I want you to think about those communication methods and give me 4 examples. Okay. So your next question, I hope that went well, by the way, on 24. The next question, question 25. So we're looking at page 44, question 25. It says, outline how to identify an individual's communication and language needs, wishes and preferences. Use sentences in your answer. So because we're outlining, we need to write that as a couple of sentences. 2 to 3 will be enough. So when we are thinking about identifying somebody's communication preferences, if we think about children, a lot of it is going to be down to trial and error. It may be that a child has got, I don't know, an ear infection and they're not able to hear you saying their name. If you're saying, Billy, come here, and they're not hearing you say their name, then perhaps getting their attention face to face, perhaps that little bit closer, they'll recognise that you are there to speak to them, and then the communication will flow. It really depends on that individual. So again, we need to think about individual needs. So it could be somebody, for example, with autism. So somebody with autism may not recognise that you are looking them in the eyes. So if you're working with a child who doesn't make eye contact, it's going to be very difficult for you to gain that eye contact. So you're going to have to think of different ways to communicate. You could think of gestures, so like, are you okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down, smiling, yeah, sad. There's lots of different ways you can think about using your face to communicate. You could draw pictures, or you could have picture cards pre-made. So like I said before, the example of having like a picture of a toilet. Do you need the toilet? Would you like to play? Are you happy? Are you sad? You can either sit and draw with them. Perhaps they will communicate through that drawing, which would be beneficial. Or you could have pre-made cards, which might help them. We can also think about writing as well. So obviously as people get older, we're talking more into sort of adulthood now, it might be that you need to get somebody to write something down. So if we think of a specific example, it could be that, perhaps you use this qualification to go and work with adults and you work with people that have had a stroke. Somebody that's had a stroke might really, really struggle to speak verbally because their mouth will be impaired. Their muscles will be affected here. That is going to affect their verbal speech. But because usually it'll just be the one hand that is affected because it affects them one side down, they could write you something with their other hand. And that can be quite a simple method for a very complicated situation. So trial and error was your first sort of one to think about there. Secondly, we're going to think about observation. So observation literally just means watching how other people communicate with that person or child. So If you are working in a nursery and you're brand new and you don't know any of those children that are in that room with you, the best way to get around that is to observe and just learn from what others find works well. You could speak to family and friends, so that's your third option. So we've got trial and error, observation, watching what people are doing, and speaking to family and friends. Now, family know their child best, parents know best, the carers know best, so find out what works for them. The next part, reading the care plan. So obviously that information will have come from family, friends, from the care workers and nursery staff that have already been working with that child or adult for quite some time. So look at their wishes or their preferences in that care plan. And if you are really struggling, if there's not much help out there that is helping, then it's time to speak to some professionals, okay? So if you've worked your way through, you've tried different methods, if you have watched how the other staff communicate and they're also struggling, if the family are saying, well, he doesn't speak at home either, if their care plan says nothing about communication, then perhaps it is time to speak to a professional. And when we're thinking about speech, we need to think about going to a speech and language therapist. You may well see this written down as an SLT or SALT, speech and language therapists. But also you can get people like social workers, tutors, psychologists involved as well. So when we're thinking about outlining this question, I would like you to write sort of 2 to 3 sentences there. So in order to identify a person's individual communication methods, I would say, try different methods out with them, read the care plan, see what their preferred method is, ask mum, ask dad, ask their carers if they're in care. Find out what works already. And if there is a problem, to perhaps speak to a senior to try and get a referral for a speech and language therapist. Okay, so now that you have finished question 26, I've put myself on a wide angle lens because I just looked at that previous bit and thought, it's all practice, isn't it? Trial and error, as per your last question. So we should now be on to question 26. Identify the 7 barriers to communication. Okay, so these you'll find on your slide, but I will talk through them. So barrier number 1 is an environmental barrier. Barrier number 2, psychological barriers. 3, emotional barriers. 4, social barriers. 5, speech and language barriers. 6, cultural barriers. And number 7, English as a second language or an additional language. So let's go back to number 1. So an environmental barrier could be the position that somebody is sat in. Perhaps they can only hear you if they're sat on your left or if they're sat on your right, if they have a hearing loss. Perhaps it's that they prefer to lip read. So if you're not facing them, they can't see what you're saying because they read your lips rather than listen. It could be lighting. It could be very dull lighting. It could be too bright. Some people are very photophobic, we call it, when it's very bright. There could be lots of external noise. So if I was sat here now and there was a pneumatic drill or my washing machine was going, it might be very difficult to hear me. Sometimes temperature can affect people's ability to communicate because if it's too hot, we're not fully concentrating. Likewise, if it's too cold, we're thinking about how to warm up rather than how to talk to somebody. Maybe we're getting confused with what people are saying or we're getting quite agitated and angry. People can get very frustrated or uncomfortable if there's not enough space for a conversation. So if I was going to do an example there, but I don't really want to. If I was right up here to the camera, perhaps some of you might not want to just watch my nose. Yeah, but obviously when it's face to face, I wouldn't want somebody right up in my face, definitely not. Psychological barriers, so it could be that somebody has a psychological barrier because of prior abuse, neglect, especially with those young children who haven't developed the social skills to communicate, because at home things just haven't been a welcoming environment to learn how to communicate effectively. If you've got a child who is ignored, they haven't learned social skills. Number 3, barriers, emotional barriers. So it could be that people are quite shy. You could have a child that's very, very quiet and it is their preference just to remain quiet. They could have a very, very low level of confidence for various different reasons, but they may not wish to speak to you because you are a new face, and you might have to get that rapport with them first, that relationship with them first, before you can develop any further. Social barriers. So it could be that somebody has sensory loss, so it could be a hearing loss, it could be a sight impairment. So if you're working with a child who uses hearing aids but their batteries have run out, then that's going to be an issue. If you are working with a child who has quite severe prescription glasses and they've not got them with them, or a lens has dropped out, that's going to become a social barrier for them. Speech and language barriers. So I talked already on the last question about a stroke. So we generally think of people having strokes when they are sort of that bit older, but there are some cases where children have strokes as well. Cerebral palsy. So cerebral palsy, cerebral meaning brain. So cerebral palsy is caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain, normally through sort of birth, premature birth, etc., where a child's brain is affected, therefore their speech may be impaired. So one of my sort of best friends, she has cerebral palsy, her speech is fine, her hearing's fine, her sight's fine, and she uses a wheelchair because that's the part of her brain that doesn't work for her, in terms of like her mobility, her muscles. Whereas, you know, for other people, for other children, it could be that they can walk absolutely fine, they can run a marathon, but they can't hear. Cultural. So cultural barriers to communication. This could be related to gender. So certainly when I worked in my old job, I worked with a man who was from Abu Dhabi, and he did not wish to communicate with me because I was a woman. He would rather wait. Inappropriate use of gestures. So this is quite an interesting one actually, because at the moment we've obviously got to communicate and say hello like this instead of shaking hands. In some cultures it is inappropriate to shake hands, and that's quite an interesting one because obviously at the moment none of us are allowed to. So we could call that, I suppose, a coronavirus barrier. Only joking, don't write that one down. So in terms of these inappropriate gestures, in some countries this means I am okay, and this means no. Yeah, that's us, isn't it? This means no and this means yes in this country. However, in some countries this means no and this means yes, which is very confusing. It must be so confusing to somebody who comes here and they say, would you like a cup of tea? And they say, meaning, yes, I would. Oh, I don't know. So we need to make sure that we are approachable and that we understand that that person has that barrier. And then culturally, onto English as a second language or additional language. So obviously in the room, when we were in the classroom, we had a very diverse class where there were several different languages. And normally I would get somebody to tell me sort of an example of, you know, how they find some perhaps difficult words, or perhaps when people moved here they found it quite difficult. I've certainly taught people who sort of joined classes when they were sort of in their teenage years. They didn't know a word of English and they're sat there with no support because they haven't been assessed yet, wondering what the hell is going on, which must be quite terrifying. So those of you that are born in Britain, I would just get you to think about perhaps, you know, if you went to a country, even like Spain, it doesn't have to be, you know, really far away. if you went to Spain and sat in a classroom where everything is in Spanish, or if you went to France where everything is in French, Poland where everything's in Polish, you know, we're not going to be able to read the signs, the warning signs about fire even. We'd have to rely on those symbols. We wouldn't be able to understand perhaps certainly a full sentence. We might pick up a key word if it sounds similar to the English word, but it must be very, very sort of scary. Okay, so in terms of identify those 7 barriers, I've kind of gone a bit above and beyond here. I feel like I've been talking for far too long. So you don't need to write everything that I've said by any means. So for 26, what it wants you to do is to identify those 7 barriers. So what you can do is you can write them as a list. However, if you write them as a list, you need to put an example of what that barrier means. So for example, you could say environmental barriers such as a noisy environment. Like I gave the example of my washing machine. If my washing machine was on right now, my house is open plan, you'd hear it. You could then say psychological barriers such as a child who's been neglected, emotional barriers such as a child who is shy, social barriers such as a hearing or sight problem, impairment, speech and language barriers such as cerebral palsy, cultural barriers such as handshakes and gestures, and English as a second or additional language barrier such as not understanding words written and verbally because it's a foreign language. Okay, so pause this video whilst you get number 26 done on page 44, and then I shall talk you through the next question, which again is another poster. We are quite poster-tastic in this booklet, but most people find it beneficial. Okay, pause me now. Okay, so now that we have looked at the 7 barriers, what I would like you to do is to have a look at the poster. Okay, so the page says identify factors that promote communication and overcome barriers. You are going to create a poster to demonstrate your understanding of how to overcome at least 4 factors that promote communication and help to overcome communication barriers. So the way that we're going to display it is we're going to have in the middle of your page promoting communication. Okay, that way we can have a spider coming out with, well, it's not quite a spider because it's only got 4 legs. We could call it a bug. Bugs have 6 though. Right, okay, so you should now have your page, which is a bit like this without my writing on it, with your promoting communication and your 4 little legs coming off of it. From there, I want you to have a think about different things. So if we think about English as a second or additional language, you know, take yourself back to Poland or France or Spain or wherever it was that you were imagining that you just went, where you were sat in a classroom and everything was in that language, everything was written in that language and you didn't understand a single thing. What would help you to overcome that? So hopefully you'll have thought of a translator. Okay, so a translator is a person who will be able to sit and translate the work of, or the speech, or the written work of a person who is talking or writing to you. So it's used to communicate between people's different languages to overcome those difficulties. We're thinking about a hearing problem. How could we overcome a hearing impairment? So in terms of overcoming a hearing impairment, there are quite a few different ways we could do that. One, it depends how severe that hearing impairment is. So if it is only very slight, so if I think about my partner's mum, she has a hearing impairment, she uses hearing aids. There's one way of overcoming it, but the batteries die so quickly in those hearing aids. So another way is to raise our voices, because we're trying not to patronise, but it can be very, very tricky. She doesn't mind, she's okay with us shouting, because if we don't shout, quite simply, she misses out on conversations, she can't hear. Another way that we deal with her hearing loss is she cannot communicate very well in groups. So if there's 7 or 8 people in a room and they're all chatting and there's a couple of conversations over here and a couple over here and I'm trying to talk here, I would need to be quite close so that she could hear me, but also she lip reads. She's learned how to lip read over time as a bit of a coping mechanism. So you can think about that for hearing loss. You can think about the hearing aids. You can think about breaking down those environmental barriers such as the noise in the room, small groups, and face-to-face communication to allow somebody to lip read. So for that hearing loss, you only need to give sort of one example of that, but we are looking for it in a sentence. So to overcome hearing loss, a person could use hearing aids. To overcome hearing loss, the person may benefit from speaking face-to-face with the person so they can lip read. To overcome hearing loss, the person may find it easier to communicate in a room of an empty room rather than a room full of people. When we are thinking about self-esteem, so if somebody has an emotional barrier to communication, we need to be able to communicate with them still. So if you're working with a child who is particularly shy and they do not want to open up to you, they might not believe in themselves very well, they may have been through some childhood trauma, whatever it is going on there, we need to be very, very positive in our language. So I think as humans, we can quite often pick out negatives very easily. Don't do this, don't do that. You know, certainly some of you who have got children or have previously raised children, you'll know that you're saying no more than you're saying yes, of course. And it's going to be so important to that child with a very low self-esteem to be built up and to be positive. So rather than saying, no, don't do that, it's about trying to say, try this instead, let's do this instead. And about trying to switch everything to a positive, because it needs to be unconditional, that positivity to build their self-esteem. We could think about cerebral palsy. So if somebody with cerebral palsy is finding it very difficult to speak, perhaps they have a problem with their muscles in their face, you would have to have very good active listening skills, okay? You're going to have to give that person time to respond. So perhaps they are struggling to reply to you, they're thinking about what to say, the message from their brain to their mouth maybe takes a little bit longer and they might speak a bit slower, it might be quite unclear. So it's really important that you do listen carefully and also that you nod and smile to give that reassurance. So I've given you sort of 4 examples there. So if you've got somebody with a language barrier, so if somebody uses a different language to you, you could get a translator. People talk about using Google Translate. Now for some languages, Google Translate is amazing, and for other languages, it just isn't working at all. So you'd have to just check that. But yeah, certainly a human translator would be great. Cerebral palsy, so we've talked about active listening, making sure that you are listening to them and giving them the time to respond. We've talked about hearing loss and making sure we are minimising those barriers such as noisy places, being face-to-face, lip reading, and hearing aids. And then we've also talked about self-esteem and how important it is to be very, very positive to that child. A couple of other ways, in case you want a couple of different ones in there as well, if you're still struggling to think of one perhaps from your own, we could say about speech and language therapy. So speech and language therapy is used for children with a development delay. So if a child is not meeting their normal development milestones, which speech and language is one of them, they can go to a speech and language therapist. We could think about using their preferred language. So if a child has always used Makaton, then perhaps we should be learning how to use Makaton so that we can communicate with them. It's important to tell you as well that when you use Makaton, you say the word with it. You'll have to watch some YouTube videos. I would normally show you a clip at this point, but there's a couple more for you. Okay, so you should end up with a poster that is something like this. Please don't just copy it. Please make sure it is your own work. But I just wanted to talk you through that one. So that will be the end of chapter 4, unit 4. It is quite a short one. So by the end of it, you should know those communication methods and know how to communicate with individuals. There are so many different methods, and obviously you can continue doing research on these bits. It is quite a small unit in comparison to some of the others, but this one is like a feeder into other units. So we will be looking further into communication, especially in those last 3 units when we look at autism, learning disability and physical disability. So we do revisit it. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope it was helpful. Any questions at all, please don't forget, you can call me, you can text me, you can write to me on Microsoft Teams, you can write to each other.